Should a doctor prescribe poetry writing or visiting an art gallery as an alternative for medication? Medical professionals are doing so in a range of countries. The benefits of creative and community activity for health and well-being are increasingly being recognised globally. Could this be the case where Western medicine is catching up with practices First Nations communities have enacted for millennia? How are health and well-being impacted by creative art? The episode you're about to listen to was presented as part of the Poetry on Prescription Healing Through the Arts Symposium, a collaboration between the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research and the Health Research Institute at the University of Canberra. This two-day symposium brought together artists, health practitioners, and end users to learn more about the relationship between creative art and well-being, with a special focus on poetry. It was held at the University of Canberra over the 22nd and 23rd of November 2024.
My name is Michelle Bortzi. I completed a PhD on the poetry of W.H. Auden in 2003, and I've had a huge interest in poetry since I was in my teens, and I've been writing critical work on poetry for a couple of decades now. Professor Paul Magee is Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research at the University of Canberra. He writes poetry and has also published extensively on the history, ethnography and philosophy of poetic composition, the links between orality and writing, and the relationship between creativity and traumatic thought. Paul's he's had a long involvement in socially impactful deployment of creative arts for well-being and repair. This includes his decade-long role as a co-investigator on the Defence Arts Programme and his work with Indigenous communities as a member of the Story Ground team. Paul.
Thanks, Michelle. This paper attempts to isolate an ethical and curative power in the way language is used in the poems we celebrate. The claim will be that the original aspects of poetic diction remind us of something quite specific. It is that we have a vast freedom to innovate in the words we speak our lives, our identities, and even our sufferings through. For there are ultimately no binding rules to innovation in any language. But that vast freedom comes, as we shall see, with one proviso. We have to be saying something new. The argument will begin with an example of the kinds of novel linguistic work that critics value in poems. The 21st sonnet of W.H. Auden's 1938 sequence In Time of War includes the famous and unusual phrase, "Anxiety receives them like a grand hotel." That enjambed phrase there in the second last stanza of the poem. Anxiety receives them like a grand hotel. Critic Terry Eagleton celebrates the phrase in a 2010 review. Eagleton's appreciative discussion of Auden's words will provide us with initial purchase on the sort of unusual utterances poetry is famous for. I'll proceed to show that innovative poetic phrases like Auden's are not distinct from, but rather exemplary of, how language change works more generally. The phrase anxiety receives them like a grand hotel is, Eagleton writes, genuinely metaphysical, yoking together concrete and abstract so that each interferes interestingly with each other. Rain's images, by contrast, are too fastidiously self-regarding, too enraptured by their own show-off contrivance to light up actual bits of the world. Now, as you can see, Eagleton's appreciation of Auden's illuminating phrase comes in the course of a critical attack on the type of diction that he thinks falls far short of it. So what we're in fact reading here is an excerpt from Eagleton's review of Craig Rain's 2010 novel, Heartbreak, a work of would-be poetic prose. But stripping the reference to Rain out for the moment, we can see that Eagleton is attributing two virtues to anxiety receives them like a grand hotel. Firstly, the phrase brings together the abstract the concept of anxiety, abstracted from any specific case, and the concrete figure of a grand hotel. And it brings these two things together in such a way that, quote, each interestingly interferes with each other. This serves a second virtue, quote, to light up actual bits of the world. Now, to flesh out the kind of things that Eagleton is getting at here, we might imagine a reader's thought processes as something like the following. The phrase anxiety receives them like a grand hotel is certainly unusual and might at first blush just seem boggling. We can imagine a person or even a type of accommodation receiving others like a grand hotel, but not an abstract emotion, and certainly not anxiety. In other words, there's a more or less formulaic expression here, and Auden is using it the wrong way. But as the reader ponders this strange collocation of words, some reference points might start to become available, such as, anxiety could well be like a grand hotel for some practiced individuals, because, however horrible, it actually serves as their comfort point, including perhaps because their tense expression of it in company serves to make the problem someone else's. Those people have found an accommodation with their anxiety. Conversely, the reader might start to imagine a grand hotel as anxiety-inducing. Think of the questions that at odd moments arise in such surrounds. Who made love in this bed last night? The bed that I now find so comfortable. And who will be having sex in it tomorrow? And whether it was to have sex or not, how many thousands of bodies have slept in these same sheets as me, eaten from these dishes, worn this robe? Inasmuch as the concept of anxiety and the concept of grand hotel interfere with each other in this proliferative manner, generating new thought in their very mismatch, we can grasp Eagleton's claim that such a phrase serves, quote, to light up actual bits of the world. But how does the act of eliciting this kind of cascading rearrangement of our concepts relate to what I referred to above as poetry's ethical and curative power? I'm going to argue that strange, illuminating phrases, such as Auden's, serve to remind us that we have vast freedom to innovate with the words we speak. That said, there is, as I noted earlier, a proviso here, in poetry and everyday language use alike. For linguistic innovations to be accepted, they have to be saying something new. To start bringing this proviso to the fore, consider a very different sort of unusual language use. Those cases where an author speaks unconventionally, but doesn't actually have anything new to say. Now, if it's not already apparent, Auden hates Craig Rain's book, and this is an extensive quote from that same review. Tears, the narrator, so this is Rain's narrator, tears, the narrator tells us obscurely, come with a non-negotiable fixed-rate moral currency, as do Hitler negatively and Shakespeare positively. They are like diarrhea, unquote. Quote, we need, quote, he adds, quote, a poetics of crying, unquote. There is talk of the, quote, semiology of innocence, unquote, and so forth. We learn with a mild frisson of amazement that, quote, all art is sincere and artifice, unquote, as well as that Shakespeare is a genius despite some of his stuff being a bit iffy. There are pregnant pronouncements such as, quote, the myth of our attractiveness survives its destruction, unquote. In the margin, the reader is invited to inscribe a large approving tick. Eagleton's point is that none of these unusual utterances actually have anything new to say. True, they take a novel form. People don't tend to say tears are like diarrhea, or we need a poetics of crying. But nor can either statement be said to, quote, light up actual bits of the world. Their unusual form is really nothing more, as critic Robert Pinsky writes in another context, than, quote, a kind of badge establishing that the writer is a poet. Who else would speak with such strangeness and gravity? But actually, we don't need those kind of badges. We already have a way to say I'm a poet, and it's just that, those same 4 words. The ruse pretending otherwise is annoying, leading us, Pinsky continues, quote, to expend force on self-regard at the expense of life, trivialising the ambitions of poetry. Poetic judgment is aimed like a hatchet at this sort of thing. What is more, languages operate in a very similar way, at the point at which their users judge whether or not to take on board new linguistic forms. We see this firstly in language's intolerance towards unusual expressions with no new message or experience to convey. Now, in referring to that intolerance, I have in mind first and foremost the fact that true synonymy is vanishingly rare in any language. As linguist Adele Goldberg points out, quote, near synonyms reliably have different contextual restrictions or background frames. They may differ, for example, in terms of formality, dog versus pooch, perspective, ceiling versus roof, or attitude, skinny versus slim. When words and phrases do not differ from each other in some such way, we judge the less common way of saying exactly the same thing awkward, mildly off, non-native, or even outrightly incorrect. Linguist Martin Hilpert offers an amusing list. Mary is the smarter lawyer than John. Over there is the asleep dog. Ungreen, unawake, unspecial. I brought the table a glass of water. In each of these cases, there's already a conventional way of saying the same thing. For instance, Mary is a smarter lawyer than John. Nor can these kind of judgments be put down to mere matters of taste. Actually, they reflect some simple statistical facts. Take the second of these items, with its awkward, non-native reference to the asleep dog. There are 99 phrases in the general form cry myself to sleep for every one instance of cry myself asleep in the 520 million word corpus of contemporary American English, a massive compendium of spoken and written language from that nation. For another example of the fact that our sense of what is natural and unnatural in language is not a mere matter of taste, take the familiar phrase explain this to me. It displays exactly the same distribution in relation to the foreign sounding explain me this. The 99 cases to one distribution patterns of these two pairs of natural and non-native English expressions are broadly representative of frequent phrases in any language. When it comes to saying the same thing, words and phrases compete for a distributional niche, and the more frequent way of saying the same thing overwhelmingly drives out the less frequent. Adele Goldberg summarises this situation as follows. We consider creative uses wrong when there exists a conventional alternative way to express the same message. Now, Goldberg is a linguist, and when she refers to creative uses, she's not making any judgment as to their aesthetic appeal. A creative use, in the linguist's meaning of the term, is simply an unfamiliar way to put the language together. As for judgments of value, we can see in the literally conformist material I've just tabled, we can see in it the lineaments of the bigot's mockery of non-native speakers. By the same token, it's worth noting that unconventional, synonymous expressions are also often looked on with indulgence in relation to children. So uses like foots for feet or spire for spy come to mind, along with sweet phrases like do you want to football or what's called the newsagent man. The other thing to say at this point is that the bigot's conformist ridicule of another's failure to get the regularities in the language code is really quite distinct to the way a critic like Eagleton will attack a writer for using unconventional words to say nothing new. The bigot is affronted by difference, pure and simple. For the poetry critic, the target is narcissism, the type of narcissism that gets in the way of poetry's capacity to platform difference. But to see this, we need to turn to the corollary of the thesis we've just heard Goldberg articulate about the linguistic community's fundamental conformity. This is where the analogy between everyday linguistic judgment and poetic judgment suddenly becomes exact. When speakers already have a conventional way to express a particular meaning, they judge novel reformulations of that meaning to be less acceptable. However, when no competitor exists, speakers display a willingness to extend a verb to a construction in which it does not normally appear. So take the now common journalistic expression, the military disappeared her husband. Prior to the emergence of this new usage in the late 1960s, disappearing was something one did, but never something one did to another. That is to say, the military disappeared her husband displayed a similar statistical distribution to explain me this. It was overwhelmingly preempted by a far more conventional way of saying the same thing. They made her husband disappear. But a nuance of distinct meaning began to be felt there. As Goldberg explains, this new usage, quote, likely took hold because it, quote, emphasises the culpability of the actors and the lack of control of the disappeared people in a way that the alternative does not. The broader point that she has to make is that this kind of semantically licensed freedom is true not just of verbs, but of all other aspects of the language code as well. You can use a language in just about any way you want, provided that new formulation serves to say something we cannot otherwise say. In other words, there's this extraordinary parallel between innovation in language use and critical judgment in relation to poetry. Take the case of vocabulary for further example of the same principle. SMS, email, Instagram and download have all entered and become natural parts of the language in recent decades. Download, for instance, started to be used in the 1960s for the unpacking of military cargo and passengers from planes. Now, this was on the analogy of upload, and the reason the word was found well-formed and, acceptable enough to be used was there wasn't another word for precisely that action of unloading the troops from Vietnam, most likely. The word was found acceptable and spread with that military baggage denotation because it covered a situation we did not otherwise have precise words for. A decade later, the usage spread by analogy to software for just this same reason. We had to call it something. On those grounds and no other, the word download has become good English. It's on the same grounds that we now have to mansplain, to UK-splain, to white-splain, to mansplay, and, as I just learnt trying to get my head around AI, to bot-splain. Now, bot-splain refers to unhelpful explanations by AIs purporting to be helpful. And it seems that it can refer to condescension on part of the AI as well. All of those AI excesses constitute bot-splanations. Now, these words all found favour. This is the broader thesis. They all found favour because, just like Auden's phrase, anxiety receives them like a grand hotel, there was no other way to say it, or to say it with that degree of concision, with just that tone and range of implication. For an even more immediate insight into these operations, think of how awkward, albeit cute, the word cooker sounds when used of a cook. As in my son's long ago now statement, "Daddy, I want to be a cooker." But now recall how in conversation and print, we here in Canberra started to use the word cooker 2 years back to label the particular group of anti-vaxxers who decided to descend, as we say, upon the capital to live in tents and to protest their right to die of a curable disease. The word cooker suddenly sounded well-formed because it actually served to label something we didn't otherwise have words for. It did so. It switched into sounding like, good enough English, maybe a little bit edgy, but nonetheless like, a real part of the language. It did so the moment it had a distinct shade of meaning to express, something that actually did differentiate it from cook. But if you forget that little interlude in the language, then cooker can start to sound awkward again. It can start to sound like it's bad English. But then you might think, we also use that to refer to the people who make and sell meth. We call them cookers. And suddenly, that is good English. Yeah? It's quite fascinating. You need that nuance of non-synonymy according to these theories, which I think help make sense of a lot of stuff. So in sum, and to round up, what we find in each and every poem that speaks the world anew is, in short, an enactment of and simultaneously a model for the anarchy at the heart of all of our symbolic systems, the very thing that puts them in such frequent ferment. And what I mean by that is that the moment there are no words for saying it, all rules are off in terms of how you are allowed to use any language whatsoever, so long as it manages to communicate that meaning, to name that thing we cannot otherwise say. There's just infinite possibility for innovation constrained by that requirement to actually convey a meaning that is distinct, which can be a devilishly hard thing, of course, to do. The countervailing force to the depressing conformities all around us is the fact that there are actually no rules to any language at the point of change. Now, to be sure, systems of censorship exist, and these can contract down to the level of the workplace, the friendship network, an intimate partner, or even, and perhaps most cogently, the self. But the kind of innovative and strange opening in language that Eagleton praises in Auden will persist through any kind of tyranny because it's baked into the very way we function as language users. Poetry, I'm trying to suggest, is that reminder.
Angela again. From a non-English speaking background human, my first language is Arabic Lebanese. Communication in my household was very loud. My father wouldn't talk to us unless we spoke to him in Arabic first, so learning Arabic was very important. Going to school, different story. At home now I'm married to an Anglo-human as opposed to a Lebanese human. My English, although sounds perfect right now, is very imperfect. And a lot is lost in translation because I'm thinking in Arabic, communicating in English. Yeah. When you look at your poetry and the work you've done, have you looked at like other languages' way of expressing? For me, would be Khalil Gibran because I've read his work in Arabic and in English. And often when I'm trying to explain something to someone who doesn't speak Arabic, it's so lost in translation because there are so many ways to explain something, or English hasn't got the right words to explain. How does poetry help concatenate that?
Look, this raises so many issues. Thank you for asking this. Well, one way to approach it is to go to the research that Jen and I did over a number of years where we were interviewing poets around the globe and in some ways asking them how they got that way. And one of the things that came up just so often was that people felt they had an odd and oblique relation to language. And often that was because English, because we were interviewing Anglophone poets, often it was because it wasn't their native tongue. Or there was some other reason why they were linguistically marginalised in relation to, you know, what we fantasise as the dominant tongue. So, I mean, that would be one way to approach it. Another thing to say in relation to some of the issues you raised there is that it seems, according to Goldberg, the linguist I was citing quite extensively there, it seems that the reason you get a lot of those foreignisms, like explain me this, for instance, is that it's coming from speakers whose native language in that case is most likely Spanish. You know, there'll be Latinos in North America who basically have just reinforced over so many years, explícame esto, you know, exactly that syntactic pattern. And it just interferes with the capacity to take on board the particular conformity demanded of you in English. And so it seems that there's something about coming to any language, you know, a little bit past the point where you can speak it totally convincingly as a native speaker, where there's just that interference that happens. So that's a big part of Goldberg's work, is that And maybe the positive side of that is sometimes those mismatches are glorious, you know, and we can see it even sometimes when people take metaphors from their language and translate them into English. Like in Bahasa, you say, what are you doing? And someone will say, saya rumah makan. What are you doing? I'm eating air. You know, just eating air, just, that's it. Walking around, I'm eating air. You know, sometimes that stuff really name something we can't name in English. You know, so, yeah.
Fascinating, Paul. Thank you. I was really, really interested in the distinction that you drew from the Eagleton Review between novel and innovative bits of language that have a genuine disclosive power that can light up a new part of the world for us, and language that is novel but not disclosive.
Yeah.
And I think it's very, very interesting trying to separate out those two, particularly in relation to ethics. So one of the things that you said that I thought was really interesting there is the idea of narcissism and self-identification as a poet as being part of what's wrong with the language that is novel, or rather, new without being disclosive. And I know exactly what you mean, and I hate it. You know when you come across a student essay, or you come across just pretentious poetry that's not interesting. It's just someone trying to bullshit, exactly, crapping on. Yeah. So, but how do we actually anatomize the ethics of crapping on? Because I actually think this is really interesting, in that, you know, what is, my hypothesis that I'd put to you, and that I'm curious about where you'd go with this is that what's happening in a moment of the generation of new language that actually has disclosive power is that there's a kind of humility, there's a kind of honesty, and a kind of commitment to using language as effectively and precisely as possible to capture this previously unspoken phenomenon, whereas in the opposite, crapping on, it's not someone being committed to being honest and clear and precise. It's someone who's just showing off or using a new word that might be, long and unfamiliar, even if it's not the best word. And that, to me, has an ethical valence. Either you're being, it's like, either you're being honest, either you're trying to delineate a new thought, or you're just kind of being decorative and tedious. So when you try to move from that distinction to an ethical discussion, is that where you're going? Is the difference between honesty and narcissism the key thing there, or are there other things that are in play? Where else are you sort of taking this in your mind?
Well, look, I don't feel the kind of ire that, say, Terry Eagleton does. I'd find it very hard to work myself up to this kind of flights of excoriation. But I must, there is that Marion Moore line, I too find it annoying about poetry. Like, it's an exhausting art form. It can be very draining to read. It can be draining when it's really good, because it just pushes you back on your own resources in such a drastic way. That can be exhausting. And then utterly annoying when it's bad, because you have to read so slowly, because you have to be open as an honest reader to the possibility that there's something here that's actually being said in Craig Rain's book, or whatever. You have to go through that experiment, and if it's just giving you a dud every line, you know, that's exhausting. But I think this totally can head in an ethical direction, or it can head in a totally intellectual, almost philosophy of science direction. And I think that's the brilliance. This is Adele Goldberg's work, who's an extraordinary linguist who has brought together different strands of the linguistics of new words and phrases, and various aspects, studies of non-native speakers and what's happening with the stylistics of their language. She has a philosophy background, and I think it really shows in that framing of the thinking. She doesn't write about art at all, but it doesn't take much to just see, oh, this is just like what critics do or poets do. And another way of thinking about that ethical act is, if this stuff is correct, well, the poet is as much engaged in that kind of ethical act that you're delineating as the critic. You know, pesky people, you know. So,
I may be taking this to another tangent, but with regards to language, and for me, maybe the wrong word is weaponising it. And having worked in the field of management consultants, who I wouldn't call poets, but maybe some of them think they do, and potentially in the university sector, I really related to the words of using a word that there already is a word for, and I've seen it alienating audiences. So that, I'm not sure what my question is, but my question is it a fine line, like where I feel like with a poet, there's a lesson in that and you're learning more, but if you're trying to communicate a new strategy or something like that and you put, so a lot of the times I say, so what do you mean by that? And they tell me what they mean. I go, well, why didn't you just say that?
yeah, let's lean into that one.
Yes.
Yeah, well, look, if you want to find the greatest proliferation of new words in any language, you head to cults, right? That is literally where you find it, because in a cult, you constantly come up with new words and phrases, and the effective meaning, the novel meaning of the phrase is, this is something we say and they don't say. Yeah? So cults are just full of new words. Like, look at Scientology, you know, extraordinary proliferation in new language. Basic message is, this is our word for plate, or our word for paper, or our word for chair, and it means, you know, you and me, we're us, and they're not. Like, and I think a lot of management speak is, it does say something new in the world, and it says something like, you know, we're not just talking about whatever it is, we're committed to a particular program, you know, that happens to involve the whatever. Yeah, that's